Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Today we will be tagging along with Andrew Jackson in his Southern campaign, looking into a design change for the Star-Spangled Banner and providing updates on other notable developments and firsts. I am super excited to get into the episode, so let's go. Welcome to 1818 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and the White House holds a special grand reopening ceremony with a reception hosted by the President, James, and the First Lady, Elizabeth Monroe. The damaged walls and intricately carved stone ornaments have been restored, but a few changes have also been made. James Hoban, the original designer of the White House, used timber framing instead of brick to reconstruct the interior walls and substructure in order to finish the work quickly. A decision which in the future will lead to another major overhaul. And despite the many rounds of renovations, there are actually some scorch marks from the fire still visible today on the stonework of the White House, left uncovered as an important reminder of our story. As we get into the year, we'll be picking up with General Andrew Jackson, who re-entered our story near the end of last year and is once again at the head of a frontier army. News of conflicts between Southern settlers and Indians in the area, especially that Scott massacre, has hardened public opinion. Settlers along the Georgia and Alabama borders are eager to receive some additional protection in the form of the United States Army, which Washington officials aim to provide, though they hope to keep the fiery General Jackson within bounds, fearing that any wrong moves in Spanish Florida could trigger an international crisis. Jackson, however, interprets his orders broadly. From his perspective, the United States has a right to pursue hostile forces wherever they are, and Spain's inability to police Florida justifies unilateral American action. He begins to assemble a mixed force of United States regulars, Tennessee and Georgia militiamen, and Creek allies. In total, about 3,000 men are expected to march under his command. Supplies are gathered at Fort Scott on the Georgia side of the border, while Jackson presses his subordinates to be ready for a long and punishing campaign. Now, even before setting out, Jackson makes clear his intentions in letters to officials. He speaks of protecting American citizens and punishing hostile tribes, but he also emphasizes the need to strike deep into Florida to eliminate the Seminole threat at its root. This kind of foreshadows that for Jackson, half measures are not going to be acceptable. By early March, Jackson is ready. His army crosses into Spanish Florida and begins a swift march southward. This pseudo-invasion is not specifically authorized by a declaration of war, nor has Congress authorized a campaign against Spain, yet Jackson moves with confidence, certain that bold action will silence his critics. The soldiers advance through difficult terrain, destroying Seminole villages along the way. Some communities are burned outright, others are abandoned in haste as word spreads of Jackson's approach. Seminole families scatter into the swamps and pine barrens, seeking to evade capture. For Jackson, the goal is not only to punish resistance, but is also to dismantle the network of settlements that has been providing shelter to fugitive slaves. After 5 days of marching along the Apalachicola, the army reaches the site of the destroyed Negro Fort. And here, Jackson orders one of his aides, James Gadsden, who is now the Lieutenant of Engineers, to construct a temporary fortification to protect badly needed supplies expected to come up the river any day from New Orleans. This installation is named in honor of James and is called Fort Gadsden. And in case the name didn't already give it away, yes, he is related to Christopher Gadsden, for whom the Don't Tread on Me flag is named, James being the grandson of Christopher. Now, as April begins, Jackson Army nears Kanhagi's town, the first of the Miccosukee villages, and is joined by a detachment of nearly 400 Tennessee volunteers, led by Lieutenant Edward Elliott, and a party of Friendly Creeks commanded by Chief William McIntosh. The force is soon surprised by a sizable number of Indians herding cattle near a pond about a mile and a half from Kanhagi's town. Before the outnumbered Indians can retreat into nearby swamps, 14 are killed, several others wounded, and 4 women captured. 1 American is also killed in the impromptu attack and 4 others wounded. Jackson continues his advance but finds Kanhagi's town abandoned. The Indians have left behind a message, however, one unwritten and unspoken, but that the Americans hear loud and clear. In the village square, a number of scalps are suspended on a red pole. They are recognized as those of the victims of the boat ambush on the Apalachicola from last November. In a nearby dwelling, the soldiers make another grim discovery, finding nearly 300 more scalps, all male, which, according to Adjutant General Butler, quote, bore the appearance of having been the barbarous trophies of settled hostility for 3 or 4 years past. Now, the command moves out of Kanhagi's town the same day and continues to pursue the retreating Indians. Meanwhile, reports filter back to Washington, where some diplomats worry that Spain will interpret this incursion as an outright invasion. The dilemma for Monroe is that Jackson is already in the field, and reining him in from a distance proves to be nearly impossible. Before we continue this story, however, we will cover another big story, which centers around the American flag. Now, as I mentioned in our very first episode, which I wish I could re-record honestly, as being now over 40 episodes in, I feel I've learned a lot about how to better put this show together, record, and edit, but I digress. I mentioned how the flag, first adopted in January, known as the Grand Union flag, was the 13 red and white stripes, but in its top left field, or canton, was the Union Jack. And this design was quickly replaced as the Revolutionary War broke out with the flag known by the misnomer Betsy Ross flag, which was designed by Francis Hopkinson and replaced the Union Jack with a circular constellation of 13 stars. To denote the addition of both Vermont and Kentucky into the Union, the flag was updated in 1795 and now had 15 stars in a linear pattern in the canton with 15 stripes as well. This is the flag that's flown for the last 23 years and was the inspiration for Key's Star-Spangled Banner poem. Today brings a huge update to the flag, not just because stars are added, but also because it's decided that continuing to add corresponding stripes for each new state will eventually cause the flag to become unsightly. A committee is formed and consults Captain Samuel Reed of the United States Navy, and he proposes a few options. Firstly, being a 13-stripe and 20-star flag, or a 13-stripe flag with an eagle in the canton, and finally, a flag divided into 4 sections featuring stars, stripes, an eagle, and the Goddess of Liberty. Now, they take the first suggestion and go with the 13-stripe, 20-star flag, and on April 4th, Congress officially adopts the design of the flag of the United States going forward as having 13 red and white stripes to represent the original colonies, beginning with red on the top and ending with red on the bottom, and 1 star for each state with additional stars to be added whenever a new state is added to the Union. As of right now, there are 20 states and thus 20 stars, this being the first flag to represent the inclusion of Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, and Mississippi. So, there never was an official 16, 17, 18, or 19-star flag, and looking ahead a little, there are a few more gaps in the count, but we'll cover that in good time. The act also stipulates that the new star will be added on the first July 4th after a state is admitted to the Union. So now, the overall design of the flag is set, as well as the way in which it is to be amended. But everything else, the proportions and even the arrangement and orientation of the stars, is still up for grabs. It will be almost 100 years before these matters are finalized, and this lack of designation for the star pattern, at least outside of the flags used on Navy ships, which Monroe specifically requires be in block formation, gives rise to what is now known as the Great Star Flag or Grand Luminary Flag, in which the 20 stars are themselves arranged in a constellation that makes one big star. If you're having trouble picturing that, check out a photo such as the one that we have on our X today at 250 years of USA. Now, I did go down just a little bit of a rabbit hole looking into this, and nearly all examples of the United States flag are shown to have the red stripe appear at the top and bottom, meaning that there are 7 red and 6 white stripes in total. But in the most famous portrait of the new flag designs consultant, Samuel Reed, the flag behind him is pictured as having white on top and bottom with only 6 red stripes. That's easily enough explained, actually, as it turns out the painting is from 1815, when the old Flag Act was still in effect, and the letter of that law said only that the stripes alternate red and white, not specifying an order. This new April 4th, 1818 legislation locks in the red top and red bottom design that we know today, so it's simply a historical irony that the man who helped secure that design is pictured with the old and inconsistent styling. Answering that question kind of raised another one, because another quirk in the painting is that the flag shown only has 13 stripes, and the official flag design from 1795 to 1818 had 15 stripes. So what happened there? Well, it turns out I actually wrote about this before, but I don't believe the segment made it into an episode. I could be wrong. But even as the additional stars and stripes were added to the flag, the Navy continued to use flags with 13 stripes, as the larger bands were more visible at a distance. So Samuel Reed, being a Navy man, that is the flag the artist chose to picture behind him. Alright, now, before we catch back up with Jackson, up north in New York, the Brooks Brothers, the oldest men's clothing store in the United States, opens in the northeast corner of Catherine and Cherry Streets in New York City, where the South Street Seaport later stands. This family-owned business will continue to be held by the Brooks for over 100 years before eventually changing hands. Now, in early April, Andrew Jackson receives intelligence that some of the Indians and blacks have fled to Fort St. Marks, a Spanish installation. Now, officially, the garrison there is neutral. In practice, however, Jackson believes the post serves as a base of supply and communication for Seminole fighters and their British sympathizers. Jackson is able to seize the fort without resistance. The Spanish commander is faced with overwhelming force and simply surrenders. With St. Mark's in American hands, Jackson establishes a crucial foothold on the coast. Now, if his actions have not been inflammatory enough, things escalate when, within a day or two after taking over Fort St. Mark's, Jackson, as an example to other Indians, orders the summary hanging of 2 hostile Creek chiefs considered by him to be the prime instigators of this war. The 2 Indians had been lured aboard the flagship of a fleet of American vessels carrying supplies for the force by flying the British flag, a ruse in the gray area of legality. Jackson also orders the arrest of 2 men, both British citizens, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, who are to be tried for espionage and aiding the enemy. Arbuthnot is sentenced to hang, but Ambrister, while initially sentenced to death by firing squad, has his sentence exchanged for a lesser penalty. Jackson overrides the court's leniency, however, and reinstates the death sentence so that both men are executed before the month is out. When news eventually makes it across the Atlantic, Britain is outraged at the execution of its subjects, and the British government lodges a formal diplomatic protest against the United States, condemning the summary and extrajudicial proceedings against British citizens. Boy, that's a mouthful. So, after consolidating his hold on St. Mark's, Jackson turns his attention westward. He believes that as long as Spanish officials remain in Pensacola, they will continue to provide refuge for hostile forces. Now, back in the United States, on May 10th, Paul Revere passes away, and I wanted to see if there was any published obituaries from the time, which there are, but none mention his famous midnight ride, instead listing his services to the military. It turns out it's only long after his death, sometime in the 1860s, that Revere's life will come to be so strongly associated with the Midnight Ride of 1775. Returning to our story about Andrew Jackson, his army enters Pensacola around May 23rd, unopposed, as Spanish forces retreat to Fort Barrancas. Jackson follows the Spaniards to the fort where they surrender on the 28th of May, and the general goes on to occupy Pensacola with his troops for 14 days. With Pensacola now in American hands, Jackson considers his mission complete. He leaves a garrison to hold the city and marches his troops back to Tennessee. The United States, however, will continue to have a presence in the area through the end of the year. It is worth reminding you, dear listener, as I had to remind myself about this point, that Jackson has not been sent to Florida with orders to wage war and conquer the territory. His orders only called for him to, quote, terminate a conflict which it has ever been the desire of the president, from considerations of humanity, to avoid. And while in Pensacola, he certainly forced out any threats, but also just illegally occupied a territory belonging to a neutral country. By way of addressing this, on the 15th of July, President Monroe convenes a cabinet meeting to discuss whether General Andrew Jackson's unauthorized invasion and conquest of Spanish Florida should be disavowed by the White House. His cabinet, save John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, who's at least fine with it, disapproves of Jackson's actions. Monroe is receiving protests from the ministers of 3 world powers, Spain, Britain, and France, all due to Jackson's actions, and he orders that Pensacola be returned to Spain. Despite the headaches and the risk created by this international incident, Monroe also recognizes that Jackson's activities in Florida provide the United States with a favorable strategic position for negotiations with Spain for the territory, and, as we'll cover, Adams uses this leverage to his full advantage. Alright, now elsewhere, on July 11th, the Bank of the United States reverses its policy of expanding credit and sends notices to its borrowers nationwide demanding immediate repayment of balances due. It will take some time for the shoe to drop here, as news can only travel at the speed of a mail cart, but when massive amounts of borrowers default, a panic will ensue that we'll cover next year. The first newspaper in Cleveland, Ohio is issued by publisher Andrew Logan on the 31st of July, the Cleveland Gazette and Commercial Register. It's interesting to note that the population of Cleveland at this time is only 172 people. Now, following the War of 1812, the War Department began restructuring and professionalizing its operations under the direction of Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. The Topographical Bureau of the War Department is founded today August 1st as part of this effort, and is designed to consolidate engineering and mapping activities that previously were scattered throughout the Army. Now, while I was trolling correspondence from the year, as I sometimes do for this show, and while reading some of the Adams papers from this year, I came across a letter written so well, and with such an intriguing question that I had to include it, so you'll have to humor me for this one. I don't know what it was about General St. Clair and his defeat at the Battle of Wabash that intrigued me so much before I even began this show, but it's just a story that really stuck in my head. I deep dived the topic for the 1791 episode, and part of the story wrapped up in 92, so check out those episodes if you're curious. But St. Clair was removed from his position and actually court-martialed for the total rout the Americans received at the hands of the Indians back then. Washington was furious, and though St. Clair was cleared of any wrongdoing, his reputation became tainted with the defeat that led to the massacre of hundreds of men, women, and children, as well as the death of the prominent Brigadier General Richard Butler. So this letter is written to John Adams from Moses Lloyd Hill, who claims to be a distant relative of John, sharing the common ancestor of Henry Adams, who settled in Massachusetts about the time of the first immigration to the country. Their only prior communication was in July, when Hill asked Adams for permission to dedicate his work, soon to be published, to John Adams, which Adams gave approval and thanks for. This letter reads, "Allow me, sir, to ask of you information which I believe it is in the power of no man living except yourself to give. The proceedings of the last Congress and some publications which have appeared since have excited a very considerable interest in the minds of many relative to General St. Clair. Whether he is highly deserving of the attentions of government and the gratitude of this generation is a question which I believe you can answer. In the summer of 1813, in Philadelphia, I fell in company with the celebrated Hugh Henry Brackenridge. He was shortly to set out on the circuit of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania for Pittsburgh, and invited me to a seat in his carriage. As I had proposed to myself to travel in the mail stage, I accepted this offer. We passed through Carlisle, the late residence of Judge Brackenridge, where I had an opportunity of gratifying my curiosity. By a view of the barracks, by the only substantial and well-planned buildings of this sort in the United States, which I believe were erected under your administration. When we arrived within about 70 miles of Pittsburgh, Judge Brackenridge told me we should soon meet with an adventure which, if not gratifying to my feelings, would excite my admiration. We descended one of the most lofty pinnacle of the Allegheny, and at length drove up to a cottage, the exterior of which told us that poverty dwelt within. A tall and venerable old man, upon whose head more than 70 winters had snowed their whiteness, came out to welcome his visitors. "This," said Judge Brackenridge, "is General St. Clair." Conceive my surprise at this unexpected interview. To meet this man whom, in my childhood, I had been taught to esteem as a benefactor to this country. Among the lofty precipices of the Allegheny, secluded from society, steeped in the bitterest cup of poverty, and without a friend to relieve him, was almost too much for my feelings. There is something grand in the contemplation of fallen greatness, and I forgot the awful majesty of the surrounding scenery in surveying the hero reduced to indignance and misery. The general enjoyed tolerable bodily health for a man of his years, but his mind had received a wound that none but his Creator can heal. He talked of but little else than his last expedition against the Indians, read to us various parts of the defense of his conduct, and complained much of his country's ingratitude. Seeing me in a military dress, being at the time in the army, he inquired my rank. "Young man," said he, "I was once as you are. You see what I am now? Beware. The sea you navigate is full of shoals of hidden rocks. In youth, provide for old age, and neither trust to individuals nor the security for the rewards of your labors. We left him, and I could not but pity his misfortunes. Whether they are the result of his own conduct or not, I beg you would inform me. If he deserved not the countenance of the government farther than they gave it him, let his frailties find a more calm retreat in oblivion than he does in his old age. And if the United States have been ungrateful to him, let him, while he lives, have the gratification of knowing that some kind hand will defend his memory from aspersion. So that's rough. But upon reading this letter, I was curious if Adams would reply. And when I didn't find the reply immediately, I began to doubt he would. That was only over the course of minutes. Imagine being in Hill's shoes, though. He had to wait weeks for a reply. But Adams does, and rather promptly. He writes to Hill on the 21st of August, saying, "Your first ancestor in America lies buried in Quincy under a rough North Common granite. I lament the hard case of General St. Clair, a gentleman of letters, taste, and sense, a soldier and scientific officer, but unfortunate. And you know, success secures fame and fortune, sometimes when merit, without it cannot." A Latin phrase is then inserted into the text that I will not try to pronounce, but I can play for you here.
Careat successibus opto quisquis ab eventu, factu notandu putat.
And I'm not a Latin scholar, so don't hate me if this translation is not perfect, but it seems to translate to, "I wish he may be denied success. Whoever thinks that a deed should be judged noteworthy by its outcomes, rather than by the act itself," was written under a portrait of Oliver Cromwell, but whether it was intended as a compliment or a sarcasm, I know not. Any provisions that has been or may be made for the comfort of the general's advanced age will be very gratifying to me. His advice to you, to look to your own independence and trust it to no individual or community, is founded in eternal wisdom, as well as in the experience of General St. Clair and your humble servant, John Adams. All right, now on October 18th, Andrew Jackson and Isaac Shelby, acting as representatives of the United States, negotiate the Treaty of Tuscaloosa with the Chickasaw Nation. This agreement results in the United States acquiring a large area of land in what is now western Tennessee and southwestern Kentucky. The deal is later known as the Jackson Purchase, and involves the Chickasaw ceding their territory west of the Tennessee River in exchange for $300,000 to be paid in annual installments over 20 years. The Jackson Purchase created a distinct geographic area in Kentucky and Tennessee, still referred to as the Purchase today. And 2 days later, in a not completely dissimilar event, the United States and the United Kingdom signed the Treaty of 1818 in London, resolving several disputes over borders and other issues between the two nations. A key part of the treaty is to set the northern boundary of the United States at the 49th parallel, running from the Lake of the Woods in what is present-day Minnesota westward to the Rocky Mountains. This clarifies the border between the United States territory and British North America in that region, and also creates the Northwest Angle, a small piece of land in what is now Minnesota north of the 49th parallel. This area is surrounded by Canada and Lake of the Woods and becomes part of the United States due to a quirk in the surveying and remains the northernmost point of the contiguous United States. The treaty also addresses other issues like fishing rights and joint control of the Oregon Country, but the border agreement is the most enduring outcome, and it'll be ratified by both nations early next year. Now, on November 13th, Thomas Jefferson writes to his friend John Adams after hearing of the passing of his wife and America's second First Lady, Abigail, and I can't help but feel that a letter such as this deserves to be read, so here goes. The public papers, my dear friend, announce the fatal event of which your letter of October 20th had given me ominous foreboding. Tried myself in the school of affliction, by the loss of every form of connection which can rive the human heart, I know well, and feel what you have lost, what you have suffered, are suffering, and have yet to endure. The same trials have taught me that, for ills so immeasurable, time and silence are the only medicines. I will not, therefore, by useless condolences, open afresh the sluices of your grief, nor, although mingling sincerely my tears with yours, will I say a word more, where words are vain, but that it is of some comfort to us both that the term is not very distant at which we are to deposit, in the same cerement, our sorrows and suffering bodies, and to ascend in essence to an ecstatic meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, and whom we shall still love and never lose again. God bless you and support you under your heavy affliction. In some better news, Illinois is officially admitted as the 21st state of the United States, following the approval of the state constitution in August. Illinois enters the Union as a free state, meaning slavery is prohibited from the get-go, which is significant in the context of the growing national debate over slavery and the federal interest in balancing slave and free states. The area has thus far been part of the Northwest Territory, later the Illinois Territory, and with its population growing enough to meet statehood requirements, the admission is complete. On that same day, the Osage Nation signs a treaty with the United States ceding large portions of their traditional lands in what is now Missouri and Arkansas. This Treaty of St. Louis is negotiated at Fort Clark. In exchange for giving up millions of acres, the Osage receive $4,000 in goods and an annual payment of $1,000 in goods for 20 years. Well, that is pretty much all I've got for 1818. It's a lot of letters today, but some of that stuff I just had to include when I found it, as I think it adds a layer of humanity to our story, and I really like to do that wherever possible. Come back tomorrow as we discuss the Panic of 1819, a couple new institutions being founded and one heading to the Supreme Court, and some interesting updates about the United States Navy. Until then, like the show, comment, tell me what you are thinking about, leave it a review if possible on the platform you are listening to it on. And as I always say, most importantly, please share the show with somebody that you know that you think may enjoy American history, or that you think needs to know something that you found interesting, or for whatever other reason, share the show and help get the word out there. Until next time, this has been Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.